I'm going to go as fast as I can because, as we've just noticed, we're standing between you and drinks. Never a good place in an Australian context, and I assume it's not here either. I'm here with my colleague Marcus Carl, who's from Transport for New South Wales. I'm with Infrastructure New South Wales, and we've come to talk about the exciting things that are happening in Sydney and the New South Wales state more broadly that we're very, very proud of. The New South Wales government has made the decision to reinvest in infrastructure. So a lot of the things we've been talking about today sort of have come together in the Sydney context, and the government has actually made the decision to start a reinvestment program. Part of that decision involved establishing Infrastructure New South Wales, which is an advisory body. And our first job was to present the first state infrastructure strategy. And the first thing you need to do before deciding your strategy and your policy settings is to understand the problem. So we had similar situation at Institute of Engineers reports on a very big backlog of infrastructure, a general very strong public and business perception about the impact of missing infrastructure or underperforming infrastructure. But when we did our detailed analysis of the situation, we sort of looked at this particular graph, which showed that the New South Wales as a state had underperformed for a decade economically, and we really contextualised our infrastructure strategy as a strategy for economic growth. And when we looked at the reasons for this underperformance, one of the main drivers was there was a policy, quite an old policy, 1990, the back end of the 1990s. The government actually said that Sydney was full and that Sydney did not want to grow outside its green space, further into its surrounding green space. The consequences in restricted land supply, much higher migration out of Sydney, lower population growth, increasing congestion, certainly increasing house prices, and increasing costs for businesses. So businesses relocated as well. So when the government came to structure their promise to the people, as in their reinvestment in infrastructure, it's about infrastructure for economic growth. So they framed their objective that way. And it's particularly infrastructure that supports housing growth, strong population growth, making it a better place to live and do business. We had a very clear objective. This is just a little bit about Infrastructure New South Wales. We're a really small body. There's only about 20 of us. We have an independent board, private sector members, outnumber bureaucrats, which fabulous as a bureaucrat. And we have a remit to advise on strategies, plans, and delivery of some infrastructure projects. What is really important about the way we work and the things that we did is this alignment between, very badly labelled on this slide, but alignment between land use plans and land use strategies and infrastructure plans and budget. So this brings together the things that we've sort of talked about today, that if you know your housing and jobs growth ambitions and the vision that the government has set up for how to stimulate that growth, then you've got a framework for making the recommendations for infrastructure that will support that plan. And we also have Treasury on side. We had a funding strategy, and I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail later, but that's absolutely key to it. Jennifer's not here anymore, but I just want to reiterate that part of that Australia general, but New South Wales in particular does have a long history of working with the private sector to deliver these projects. So once we had that framework in place, what we did was Infrastructure New South Wales engaged Deloitte Access Economics. We probably also spoke to Smart Infrastructure, other areas of, we did talk to other academics, pretty much all the advisors. But what we developed was this economic model, the principles about how infrastructure actually drives government's objectives for growth through the 3 Ps. A very simple concept, but what it allowed us to do was to actually look at different strategies with different components in it, and which levers really push the buttons most successfully. And remembering that we knew which buttons we wanted to push most successfully, and it was very much about housing, it was very much about population growth, stimulating people to stay in New South Wales, to build their home, build their business, become more globally competitive, particularly in the things that we excel at, which is the finance and services industries. So there was nothing stunningly new in any of these relationships. Most of you would recognise them. The thing that we write about in our paper, and the thing that needs a lot more collaboration and a lot more international work, is actually the measurement, the math. On the left-hand side, I think, on productivity, measurement and math is pretty, we've all got many case studies on how improving infrastructure, rail and road infrastructure improves freight efficiency, lowers the input costs for businesses, improving water and energy infrastructure. In Australia, there is a big water infrastructure challenge. We haven't built a dam for 50 years. And we have industries, coal production particularly, that are very water intensive. But the math is reasonably well known, and we have the case studies. The middle line, exactly how, by an investment such as the one Jennifer just spoke about, the 95 motorway lane, how does it impact population choices about where you locate your house? How can you measure that impact and produce a model of the economy with that investment versus an economy without it? There's lots of traditional cost-benefit analysis, and that is absolutely quite well developed and used extensively, and we rely on it for our recommendations project by project. But when you're talking about strategy level and very broad programs, the measurement is an emerging art. We used international case studies. We used quite a detailed knowledge of some revitalisation areas in Sydney, and we used estimates where we could. This side, on my side, the impact of social infrastructure is very, very important. However, we had no reliable measures, and so in our model of the economy with our infrastructure strategy versus without, we actually don't have the impact of the investment in social infrastructure specifically included in it. We just say it absolutely adds value, it adds social value, it's a key component. We recommended very, very high additional investment in healthcare and cultural infrastructure, and also education to a lesser degree. But we're not able at this stage to include it in our new tool, our economic model, and it's something that we really want to sort of look around internationally and develop that capability, because we feel that portion, particularly health, is being undervalued when it comes to relative prioritisation across all of the things that governments have to decide. So this video tells you some of the, I'm relying on the man at the back, that we're actually investing this money in. You will be able to tell from the video that state rivalry is alive and well in Australia. New South Wales versus the rest of Australia, forget it. This is Barangaroo. It's along the western side of the city. It's an enormous redevelopment. This is our WestConnex project. It's about a $13 billion road project, and this is our light rail through the middle of Sydney. And this is a whole new rail corridor going from the north to the southwest of the city. This is my favourite project. I'm on this board. It is private delivery of public health with a private health component in that project. This is actually one of our first high-rise schools, public schools. We have very beautiful schools, but they tend to be laid out, and that's actually a really innovative design. And this is a new theatre complex happening down on the water, and the convention centre, which Infrastructure New South Wales is actually delivering. So as I say, that the decision of the government to embark on all of these projects, pretty much over 10 years, and is something we're very proud of. And I'll just make a quick mention of one of the secret weapons. The government decided to recycle assets, basically to exit ports and electricity businesses in order to partly fund this program. The government took that decision to the people at an election, basically. So the job of getting people behind you, you can't underestimate that in policy setting. But basically, people did support it. The New South Wales state does support that. So I'm going to hand over to Marcus to talk about the other key point, how to measure productivity improvements on a project-by-project basis.
Thanks, Jenny. Jenny's been talking quite broadly about the work of Infrastructure New South Wales, and I'm just going to focus on one quite narrow fragment of that, and that's productivity metrics. They'll be shifting from the macro to the micro, and that's not to diminish the importance of that work. I noticed this morning that Robert Piotto commented that it's not always about the big projects and the mega projects, but a series of small things that deliver incremental improvements. And that's what our productivity metrics is about. Productivity metrics is another technique for the economic appraisal of infrastructure. Now, the foundation for the appraisal of infrastructure is a cost-benefit analysis. I just want to underline the point that productivity metrics isn't intended to supplant cost-benefit analysis. It's a complementary tool. Now, the risk with cost-benefit analysis is that the calculations can fail to provide information that can inform strategic decisions about how to best deliver broad government targets, particularly where the objectives are visionary in terms of economic growth, social benefits, changing the city shape, or other land use outcomes. Part of the strategic context in New South Wales is that we're reorientating the way that we do business to focus on productivity. And in terms of the appraisal of infrastructure, we're trying to get more out of our infrastructure investment, particularly in terms of driving productivity growth. Now, the productivity metrics, they utilise wider economic benefits which aren't captured in a traditional cost-benefit analysis. The idea was initially developed in the UK by Dr. Daniel Graham, and it's been applied in the UK and also New Zealand. The process started in New South Wales with our Premier in 2012. We were looking at a whole range of initiatives which were designed to get better value for infrastructure. They were innovative, and our Premier presented them to the National Commonwealth State Forum, which is a council of Australian governments. It then referred it to the National Ministerial Council for Transport, which then referred it back to New South Wales to conduct a trial of the metrics. And this trial was intended to identify what benefits would include in the metrics, to develop a formula for the application of the metrics, and also just to see what information the metrics would give us when we applied them to real projects. The methodology that was developed by the trial reference group was that the metrics would include business travel time savings, which is essentially the benefits you get from your existing cost-benefit analysis, and then you strip out the welfare benefits, and then the wider economic benefits, those being agglomeration economies, increased output in imperfectly competitive markets, and the tax take from improved labour supply. The group recommended the following formula of taking the business travel time savings, adding the wider economic benefits, and dividing it by the cost. What that leaves you is a percentage which reveals the ratio of productivity benefits to investment. We then applied the metrics to 7 projects, and we found that the productivity impacts can be significant and also variable. The projects which performed best on the cost-benefit analysis didn't necessarily perform as well when we applied the metrics. In one case, the project which topped the cost-benefit analysis came second last when we applied the metrics. The metrics varied depending upon the type of project and the economic context of the area. They tended to be highest where agglomeration impacts were strongest, and the impacts of economic density, community cost, and business benefits are high. The main methodological problem that we had was estimating the elasticities of productivity. We weren't able to complete that within the time, and so that was then referred to the national process for developing the cost appraisal guidelines, and the Commonwealth Government now has carriage of the project, which it's finalising with the Australian Bureau of Statistics over the next year and a half. And that's going to involve the development of detailed data and also economic modelling, so we have accurate estimates. One of the things that's been mentioned quite a few times today is the importance of soft skills and affecting organisational change. Initially, productivity metrics was met with a mix of scepticism and a reluctance to move beyond the established CBA framework. So the challenge for us was to initiate a paradigm shift, and we've come a long way over the last 4 years in achieving that. I just thought I'd highlight some of the lessons that we've learned in affecting that change. Firstly was get the right people involved. Where you have a contentious national reform that involves government, the private sector and academia, you need to have all of those parties involved to bring them along with you. I think the other thing is the project also benefits from drawing in their expertise. Secondly, the people involved might need to evolve as different skill sets and organisations are required. So at the initial phase of it, it was led from the central agencies, the Premier's departments, and getting the national authorities on board. Then it went out to the transport agencies, and now it's gone back to the Commonwealth and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I think that flexibility made the project more effective. It's also important that government was a catalyst for action and not necessarily the doer. Particularly in the early stages of the project, we relied heavily on private sector and academic expertise. Now, if there are any technocrats in this room, please don't take this the wrong way, but at the start of the project, where it was contentious, we found that having someone who wasn't really deeply embedded in a technical background was useful. We had the project initially led by someone who had a background in negotiation and bringing people together, and we think that was quite critical for the success in getting through the initial broad differences of opinion that we encountered. Being persistent in the face of resistance is important, where it's quite contentious and you're getting a lot of pushback. We had the attitude we're just going to forge ahead despite a lot of skepticism and doubt. And finally, innovative policy can be unpredictable. It's in many ways a leap into the unknown. And so you have to be flexible in how you respond. We initially thought the problem was going to be with the methodology and getting agreement to that, but it turned out to be sorting out the data. We also thought that we would have the project wrapped up in about a year. Now it's almost 4 years later and we're still going. But in a way that's been a benefit, because when you're trying to initiate a significant paradigm shift, it takes time to bring people with you. And so the more time we've had, the more opportunity we've had to engage the private sector and academics and involve them in our process, get them used to the ideas we're presenting and bring them along with us. Thank you.
Oh, there it goes. Okay. These are my collaborators, Martin Petruka. Okay, I got 10 minutes here. Martin Petruka, Dov Dory, Yanif Mordecai, Martin civil engineer, Dov and Yanif are from Technion. They're the systems modelers. Joe McNitt's our student. He's an undergraduate in math. What I'm going to talk about is a workshop in April 2015 with system practitioners. The grid operator, the transit agency, and the transit agency. And basically what we wanted to do was use this methodology called object process methodology to get the understanding from the practitioner's mind onto a model. We'll tell you about what worked, what didn't work, and whether or not, how much of this stuff is science. That's it. Okay, we've heard from Eisenhower before. This is the outline. Got to go move through this very quickly. This is the problem that Bob Preto talked about this morning. Basically, you got these different systems. You want to put some bets down. You want to invest, and you want to optimize the overall, find a global optimum through time. The question is this even possible? This is how it's set up. Use this as a hypothesis. Some guiding principles. We adopt sweeping simplifications. We avoid excessive generality, and we keep digging. We keep it simple. Kelly Johnson from the aerospace community, common sense, also from the aerospace community, and first, we do no harm. And I'm going to have to skip through this. For the students in the room, I'd be happy to send you the slides. These are just basically the idea is don't believe your model. Your model and the world are different. You use the model as a tool, and you need to be able to use judgment on that. And that takes time to do it. That takes time. And whether or not the model you actually gain insight into the world. Here are just some references that you could look up. 3 of these are game theory folks. One's an operations research fellow, and another's a finance guy who was previously a physicist. Okay, so how does the system evolve over time? So we want to have some imagination here, which for 100 years we have the data for that. So from the point of view of 1915 to today, we can look at how the systems have changed over that period of time, particularly since World War II. And then we're looking out over the last 30 years, how the systems have changed. And then we're looking out to the 2045 and then 100 years where most of us here won't be around. And then why will the next 30 years be any different than the last 30 years? As we've heard today multiple times, our infrastructure has been going downhill. Our political processes are paralyzed. Why do we think it's going to get better? It could get worse. They just muddle through. And then what constitutes scientific knowledge of this? We heard this from Chris, that the reductionist strategy that's worked so well for 500 years now, there's other ways of thinking about scientific knowledge. And then our goal is to have intelligent decision making, to have some kind of collective intelligence. This is a civilization level perspective. It's long-term and strategic, and this is really the role for academics. We're not engineering consultants. We don't operate any of the systems, but we can provide this longer-term view and ask thoughtful questions about how the interactions may evolve between both the social as well as the technical. Here's the Navy Yard. Now we'll cut to the chase. This is the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. It's been around at that location since about the Civil War. It's a famous Navy Yard. It's built some tremendously famous ships for the United States Navy. I'm reporting on the third workshop. Two previous workshops were reported on at the previous international symposium, and that paper's on the website, and you can read it. So this is really going to focus on this 2015, April 2015 workshop. It extends a project, just briefly extends a funded project from the Department of Energy at the Navy Yard. Philadelphia is embedded, the social technical systems are embedded in this larger regional systems. Washington, Philadelphia, this corridor, Philadelphia, Navy Yard. So you see, oops, see this is Philly, and you see the Navy Yard right in there. And this is economically important. This whole region's it's about a fifth of the United States GDP. And the Philadelphia region is about $384 billion. So from our academic point of view, if we're able to somehow enable the system practitioners to save, just 1% in productivity, or to avoid a shutdown of this system of 1%, we're still talking a lot of money there, right? $30 billion. April 2015, we have the grid operator, PJM, SEPTA, the Regional Transportation Authority, and also the Regional Planning Commission sitting around the table. So the idea is systems modelers on the one hand, system practitioners on the other. And then we have conveners from the academic community, also included TU Delft from Newcastle, and then our systems modelers from Technion. Multiple stakeholders talk different languages, and the modeling is used to communicate, is used to think through what's going on. It's not necessarily a true representation of what's going on. Multiple engineers. Oh, geez. Okay. This is going to take. Okay. Engineers speak different languages. Engineers speak different languages, different types of engineers. So we use this objects and processes as a way to bring that together. So we wanted to develop a conceptual model. We wanted to make it useful for system practitioners. We wanted to use it as a tool for inquiry. Simple questions. And here we heard this before from at lunch. There are a bunch of related terms. Robustness, resistance, reliable, resilience, restoration, redundant, absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity. Quoting now, that should be a top quote. There should be a quote. There's a close quote, but there should be a top quote there. Dozens of definitions of resilience have been developed. The U.S. federal government alone has used almost a dozen different definitions and policy documents over the past decade. Effective implementation of resilience method requires consensus on an actionable, precise resilience definition that leads to quantitative resilience methodologies. So, of course, the question is, if you don't have that, how is some kind of thing that we think of as science even possible? This is what our starting of our model. So we have this idea of robustness, a state, the initial state, and that if you can maintain that initial state, that we'll call a quality of robustness. Disruption, state S1, and then a transformation of that state S2. Right? So if you have a severe enough disruption in the critical infrastructures of civilization, it's going to change civilization, and we don't know how. Here's our engineering resilience model. It was alluded to during lunch that there's also this ecological notion of resilience. So we're using this engineering resilience model. It's fairly simple. Again, keep things simple so you can see what's going on. S0, damage, comprehend what's going on. So you have a bunch of different stakeholders trying to figure out what's going on in a complicated situation. That in itself is a problem. Repair, right? If you can even do it, if you have the workforce, if you have the materials. We heard a really great thing about Dominion about how they're backstocking things. Then recovery, so on. Here's our framework, just a bigger picture of it. I'm just going to cut to this. This is the object process model. The squares are the objects. The rectangles are the objects. The ovals are the processes. So again, alluding to the lunchtime conversation, what we're trying to do here is understand Dove is the inventor of this language, the object process methodology. We're trying to understand the interaction of states, or let's call them objects, they're not the same, and the processes that generate them. And this is the mapping that we did over about 3 hours. Now, we originally had as a cyber physical workshop. Well, this is part of where it didn't work. We just got completely bogged down in the interactions between the system practitioners and the system modelers, just creating an interaction in that sense. So what did we learn here? Communication between the practitioners and the models is clearly a knowledge management problem. And it's time consuming and it's an expensive process that will not scale. This strategy will not work. So here's a good example. Theory and practice. So the theory was, yeah, this could be a great way of doing it. But in practice, we could see this has high opportunity costs for the system practitioners. This isn't going to, so we're trying to figure something else out. Measure of success. Well, the bottom line is if the system practitioners, the folks that make those things, lights on, trains run on time, heating and cooling. Measure of success is if they find it useful, they will vote with their feet. They will come back to the meetings. If they don't find it useful, then it means to them that it's not worth it. And so far, they're coming back to the meetings. So that's a good sign. And then, of course, for us, in the case of Joe, our student, and Yanniv, our student, they're learning how the systems work from the practitioners as well as through the modeling process. So what are the challenges? Well, we talked about it a little bit. You've got this synthesis of an increasing number of systems that you got to comprehend. That's the first challenge. Second challenge is you've got data coming in. It was alluded to today, the clean power rule, 1,560 pages. I'm sure there are probably not a lot of people that have read and understand all 1,560 pages of that rule that's going to fundamentally change the power system. So how does one comprehend that? And then there's the Quadrennial Energy Review, which also came out since April. And then there's some new legislation pending. Okay, I'm out of time here. Challenges, and then a third challenge is how does one incorporate this R&D that is happening, as we heard today, the NSF projects. How does one incorporate that into the thinking? You got a vast amount of information and models. And then, of course, there's changes in the political, economic, and social conditions. As we heard before, values change. What does it mean for infrastructure? Can there even be an overall policy perspective? We talk about this whole commanding heights, so you heard, or systems of systems, or the whole of government, whole systems approach. Is that even possible? What does that mean in an evolving system that changes in an evolving system? These are just some related data points. These were in the Washington Post recently, in the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. Visions of the future that didn't turn out the way they thought they would. That's the bottom line there. And so it justified a lot of investment, and a lot of investment got no. So what we learned is this is just scientific knowledge and the limits. A lot of this is related to an old problem of induction, and that how values and judgment influence choice, and then there's leadership issues. I'd just like to acknowledge the PJM, SEPTA, Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, the Consortium for Building Energy Innovation that hosted the workshop, the Larson Institute at Penn State that provided financial support, and Alcoa that also provided financial support, and then the Penn State Strategic and Global Security Program. Thank you.
Yes, hello, I'm David Luskin from Federal Highway Administration. For our Australian presenters, I did have one question. In the first presentation, there was a slide showing a causal chain describing the impacts on productivity. And it was showing, I believe, infrastructure as influencing freight efficiency and water and energy costs, which unleashed one of the bees in my bonnet, that there is, I find in the discussion of economic competitiveness and productivity and its relationship to infrastructure, I find the discussion has been extraordinarily freight-centric, that there is well, most obviously, you have a lot of people going around in non-freight vehicles on the road that are engaged in business. You know, you have, for example, plumbers going out on making house calls, etc. So now let's see with our second Australian speaker with the perspective on the micro. You were talking about coming up with some measure that added, I think you said savings in business travel time, which is a agglomeration economy benefit. So my question is this: for your savings in business travel time, isn't it? I want to know, was it the case that actually a large chunk of those savings in business travel time was for savings for business travelers not in freight vehicles? You included both the freight and non-freight?
If I can just go to your first point, which I think goes to the heart of your bee in the bonnet, or not bonnet, sorry. It is true that traditional cost-benefit analysis focuses on freight travel time savings, and generally when you've been talking about benefits of personal travel time savings, there's been a big debate that it's not counted, it's not monetized, and it's, you know, it's of lesser importance. Is that the point that you were trying to make?
No, my point was that in the way of forgetting about personal travel time, you have people who are traveling on business. Some of them are driving trucks, and some of them are like traveling salesmen, etc., who are in light-duty, non-freight truck vehicles. Yeah. I'm just saying that when I think of the impacts of road improvements that reduce congestion on productivity in the economy, it's very important to consider not just the business travel in freight trucks, but the business travel in the other vehicles.
Completely agree. there's an estimate of Sydney CBD, and it's probably true of most CBDs now, that about 60% of travel is services vehicles. The guy trying to fix the photocopier, the courier guy, that's absolutely true, and it is absolutely taken into account in business. The other point I was also going to make, though, in our model, is that just generally reducing congestion, making it more attractive as a place to live, and also the redistribution effects of where you can locate businesses and be efficient and cost effective and competitive in that business location. It's very, very important that you get your road and rail infrastructure right to do that. And so that's part of our model as well. Not perfect in its math yet, but it is there.